Hello, hello. Welcome to, I guess, today's class. Unfortunately, we couldn't do an in-person class this week, but God willing, next week we will get back on that bandwagon. Um, because I'm a little bit short on time, I'm gonna not spend too much time on explaining certain things, but I hope the general gist of the class will be understood and appreciated. If you'd like to sponsor an upcoming class, please reach out to me, Rabbi at Jewisherie.com. And let me know that you're excited to take part in this incredible initiative. Okay. This week's class is about counting Jews. Counting Jews. Is that a weird topic? Let's see. Does every Jew count? Of course, every Jew counts, but does every Jew count? How many Jews are there? The history of census. Oh, by the way, if you'd like to also get the curriculum for today's class, just send me an email as well, and we can hopefully get that to you soon. The history of census counts of the Jewish people from the days of Moses through the times of Kings Saul and David, plus the connection to counting 10 for a minyan. We're going to explore all these different things. So in the reading of Shkalim, Shkalim is the reading for this week. In addition to the regular Torah portion, the regular Parsha, there are certain times throughout the year that we add an additional reading to the weekly portion. This week, we actually add the reading of Shkalim, which is when the Jewish people were one of the times the Jewish people were counted using Shkalim. Shkalim are coins, and we'll delve into that. So in the reading of Shkalim, we learn about the contribution campaign, which also served as a census count. God informs Moses that census taking may only be done indirectly, via counting objects and not a direct head count. This prohibition is recalled over and over throughout history, such as when Saul and David count the people and in the Holy Temple. It is even featured today with the indirect counting of 10 people in the synagogue and shul for a minyan. Why is it prohibited to count people indirectly? Why do we count? And which verse do we use to count the people in shul? All this and more is based on actually two talks from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, both from between winter and spring, I guess, 1965 and 1983. Okay, section A, the history of the half shekel. Source one is a quote from the Sefer HaChinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch literally means the book of education. It's a very fascinating work written hundreds of years ago. The author basically compiled all the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah into one book, defining what they are. And the way he does it, he presents what the mitzvah is. Then he presents the reasoning for the mitzvah, which is usually very interesting. And then he presents some of the basic laws associated with the mitzvah. So we'll see that now with the giving of the half shekel coin. The mitzvah to give a half shekel annually. Every Jew aged 20 and older must give a half shekel to the priest every year. This is done by both poor and wealthy people, the same as the verse states, this they shall give everyone who goes through the counting. All the money was deposited in a room of the Holy Temple and would be withdrawn to purchase offerings. From the reasons for the mitzvah, God wants merit for the Jews, so he allows them to all participate equally in the offerings each year. All give equally, whether rich or poor, and all are included in the mitzvah and the merit it brings. Some pertinent laws. The sages taught that on the first of Adar, which is the month we're currently in, the announcement to bring the half shekel was made, and even the poorest of the poor was obligated to give. If he does not have anything, he should borrow from someone else or sell his clothing. As the verse says, the pauper shall not give less. One may not pay it in installments, and everyone must give, priests, Levites, and Israelites, converts, and freed servants. So everybody had to give, and you couldn't get out of it give. Even if somebody was very, very wealthy, they're a billionaire, and they say, you know what, I want to give a donation to the temple, not just a half shekel coin. That's nothing for me. I want to give 10 million shekel. That's beautiful. That's encouraged. But for this mitzvah, he needs to give a half shekel, nothing more. If he wants to give in addition to that, that's fine, as a separate thing. But for this mitzvah, that's what he needs to do. This applied during, the Sefer HaChinuch continues, this applied during temple times, and it obligated all Jews, whether they resided inside or outside the land of Israel. Nowadays, following the destruction of the temple, nobody is obligated in this mitzvah, even in the land of Israel. A person who failed to contribute violated a positive commandment and faced serious consequences, because by doing so, they separated themselves from the community, and they could not attain penitence together with the public. Nowadays, due to our sins, we do not have a temple or the half shekel, but the custom is to read this portion of the Torah, the beginning of Parshat Kisisa, each year on the Shabbat preceding Rosh Chodesh Adar. An important point I need to point out, I've mentioned this before, we don't make up the rules. God made up the rules. If we become less interested, God forbid, in doing a mitzvah, that's not enough of a reason to not do the mitzvah. In fact, there never is a reason to not do a mitzvah. The only time we're not doing a mitzvah is if we can't do the mitzvah, meaning that within the Torah's guideline, there's no room to do the mitzvah. So, for example, the mitzvah of giving the half shekel coin is only applicable when there's a temple standing, when there's a holy temple in Jerusalem standing. If there's no temple, we can't do the mitzvah. It's just it's that simple. It's not that we decided one day we're not going to do it. If there's no temple, one of the I don't know the word I'm looking for is one of the necessary things, the components for the mitzvah is not available. We can't do the mitzvah. Okay. Source number 2. This is from Rabbi Eliyahu Kito from the Sefer HaTodah, which is a very fascinating book about the Jewish year. It's a very, very interesting work. They do have it in English. It's called, what's it called? It's a 3-volume set. It's in English. You could Google it. Google Sefer HaTodah, HATODAAH in English, and you should be able to find it. Oh, man. Nope. Okay. You let me know if you find out what it's called. Okay. He says like this. An additional reason, another reason for the sages enacting this custom of reading the portion of shkalim nowadays is that very soon the Holy Temple will be rebuilt and we will need to be proficient in this mitzvah. So since Mashiach is going to come, God willing, today, and bring an era of peace and beauty and holiness to the entire universe, and the third temple will be rebuilt, we need to know about this mitzvah because we're going to need to do it again. This mitzvah is especially precious to us, he continues, because it teaches us to love every Jew greatly, for all are equal before God. When it comes to offering God communal sacrifices, all are equal. There is no rich and no poor, no close and no distant. All are close. The collective offering rises up before God and atones for our sins. How does it work? On the Shabbat, when we read Shkalim, we take 2 Torah scrolls out of the Ark. From the first, we read the weekly reading, calling up 7 people. And for Maftir, the final reading, we read from the second scroll, the beginning of Kisisa, which is about the half shekel contribution or mitzvah. So let's read the verses in the Torah as they are read in synagogues about a month before the beginning of the month of Nisan, the month of Passover, Pesach, to remind the people to give a half shekel. Okay. Source number 3 from Exodus chapter 30. God spoke to Moses saying, when you take the sum, S-U-M, sum of the children of Israel according to their numbers, let each one give to God an atonement for his soul when they are counted. Then there will be no plague among them when they are counted. Those words are going to be crucial for the rest of the class. To count them basically using a coin so that there won't be a plague among them. This they shall give everyone who goes through the counting, a half a shekel according to the holy shekel. 20 gerahs equal 1 shekel. Half of such a shekel shall be an offering to God. Everyone who goes through the counting from the age of 20 and upward shall give an offering to God. The rich shall give no more, and the poor shall give no less than a half a shekel, with which to give the offering to God to atone for your souls. You shall take the silver of the atonements from the children of Israel and use it for the work of the tent of meeting, which is other words of for the Mishkan, for the temple they had in the desert. It shall be a remembrance for the children of Israel before God to atone for your souls. So this portion was said to Moses during the Mishkan's building campaign. In the Parsha, the Torah reading of Teruma, a couple weeks ago, we read about a large collection of gold, silver, copper, and other materials, and then detailed instructions on how to use those materials to build the Mishkan and its sacred vessels, how to sew the priestly garments, and so on and so forth. During all this, God tells Moses that if he wants to count the people, he should not do so in the normal way. Rather, he should count them with the half shekel coins. The money would go to fund the atonement offerings on everyone's behalf. Moses immediately began a half shekel fundraiser, essentially, for the purpose of a census count. With the proceeds, he built silver sockets for the wooden beams, which made up the walls of the Mishkan. Several months later, once the Mishkan was completed, Moses called a second half-shekel drive to count the Jews, and the proceeds went toward the communal offerings. In this way, every Jew became an equal partner in the communal sacrifices. This collection drive became an annual tradition, an annual mitzvah. Every year in the month of Adar, a half shekel was collected from every Jew. On the 1st of Nisan, these funds would begin to be used for the sacrifices of the coming year on behalf of the people as a whole. What's the reasoning? What's the deeper underlying reason for giving this half shekel coin? So in addition to fundraising for the Mishkan and the offerings, there's a warning here for future Jewish leaders. You may count the people. You can, if you'd like, but do not count the people directly. Rather, count an object that represents the person who gave it. The reason behind this prohibition is to prevent a plague that could occur as a result of the evil eye. So every person gave a half shekel coin, and instead of counting how many Jews there are, you count how many coins you have, then you'll know how many Jews gave, how many Jews there are. The fact that this is associated with the evil eye, I'm not going to explain the evil eye right now. We're not going to get into it. You can look on Chabad.org. There's some nice write-ups about the evil eye. Nothing to be concerned about. Okay. Section B, Kings Saul and David count the nation. So now we're going to see where two major figures in Jewish history where they took part in counting the Jewish people and the different associations that we have with it and the contrast of one of the over the other, and what we can learn from them. Okay, says the Rebbe. If you have the sheet with you, it's on page 4. The Talmud relates in the book of Brachot that because King David spoke about God inappropriately, it says in the verse, God said to him, I will cause you to trip up. This says in the verse, actually. I will cause you to trip up in a matter that even school children know. As the verse states, when you take the sum of the children of Israel according to their numbers, let each one give to God an atonement for his soul. Immediately after this incident with David, the verse says he incited David to number Israel. So, the book of Samuel, Shmuel, tells of Saul's pursuit of David and the attempts he made on David's life. It's a whole dramatic story. Not going to get into the details, but something you need to know is that David and Saul equally were both very holy people. And the way we might understand the story just by looking at it the first time without really delving into it and appreciating it's what it's really saying, you have to understand they're really, truly holy and good people. And if something seems a little off, there's a lack not in them, it's in us who are reading the story. We have to learn more and understand more. In one attempt, Saul closed in on David's hiding place. David knew that Saul was in the vicinity, and under the cover of darkness, he entered Saul's camp and took Saul's arrows and water container from his side as he slept. David made his way to the top of a nearby hill, and he started a dialogue, the conversation with King Saul, begging him to end his obsessive pursuit of him. And David told Saul, if God incited you against me, I will pray that he turns your negative plans to good. Now, the Talmud explains that God was, so to speak, unhappy that David used the term incite as though God was causing Saul to sin, which is a bit of an issue, and punished David measure for measure. Says the Talmud, see that inside. Source 4. As for David's statement to Saul, if it be God that has incited you against me, let him, God, accept an offering. Rabbi Elazar said that God said to David, do you call me an inciter? In retribution, I will cause you to trip up in a matter that even school children know. As it is written, when you take the sum of the children of Israel according to their numbers, let each one give to God an atonement for his soul when they are counted. Then there will be no plague among them when they are counted. Immediately after God said this to David, it says in the verse, Satan stood up against Israel, and David was incited to count Israel. When David counted them, he did not take an atonement from them. He did not count them using some method that wasn't direct. He directly counted the Jewish people, and he was punished, as it is written. So God sent a pestilence upon Israel from the morning even to the appointed time. So years later, as we'll see inside in a moment, when David ruled over the Jewish people, he decided to take a count, a census. The Torah doesn't give a reason as to why he chose to count them. It was a punishment for David's words years earlier, saying that God incited Saul, and now God incited David to count directly, triggering a plague that killed many. So let's see source 5, Samuel book number 2, chapter 24. Again, the anger of God was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, go count Israel and Judah. The king said to Yoav, the commander of the army that was with him, "Go please to and fro throughout all the tribes of Israel, from Dan as far as Beersheba, and take a census of the people so that I may know the number of the people." Yoav said to the king, "May the Lord your God add to the people 100-fold of whatsoever they may be, and the eyes of my lord the king may see it. But my lord the king, why does he desire such a thing?" But the word of the king prevailed against Yoav and against the captains of the army. Yoav and the captains of the army went out from the presence of the king to number the people, the Israelites. So David's general, Yoav, tried talking David out of this census, but David insisted. Yoav had no choice. After all, David was the king, and you got to listen to the king. So he went out to all the Jewish towns and counted the people and returned to David with the results, as we'll see now. The verse says, Yoav presented the sum of the number of the people to the king. Israel consisted of 800,000 valiant men that drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000 men. But then came the punishment. God sent a pestilence upon Israel from the morning until the appointed time. From Dan to Beersheba, 70,000 people died. David said to God when he saw the angel that smote the people, and he said, "Behold, I have sinned and I have acted sinfully. But these sheep, what have they done? I beg that your hand be against me and against my father's house." God, not God, God, G-A-D, came to David on that day and said to him, "Go up to erect an altar to God on the threshing floor of Aravna the Jebusite." That's a fun word to say. In Hebrew, it's Hayavusi. The prophet tells David to erect an altar on the site of the future temple, and the plague would stop. And it did. Okay. Says the Rebbe. The Talmud in the book of Yoma, which is really the laws of Yom Kippur, are discussed, states, "It is forbidden to directly count Israel even for a mitzvah purpose." As the verse states regarding King Saul, and he counted them with bezek. Bezek is a Hebrew word, interpreting bezek as shards, like pieces of glass or something, meaning that every person laid out a shard and they counted the shards. So we see from there that it's forbidden to count Jews, because why else would he do a count through some other object? Rav Ashi, the sage, objects to this interpretation of the verse, arguing, "What is your source that the word bezek is related to the verb meaning to break apart so that it means shards? How do you know? Perhaps it's the name of a town, and it means that Saul counted them in Bezek, and we find elsewhere that there's a town named Bezek. As another verse states, and they found Adoni Bezek in Bezek." The Talmud answers, rather, it's not from that verse. The proof is from this verse. "And Saul summoned the people and numbered them by sheep," meaning that Saul tallied his soldiers by having each one take a sheep and then counted the sheep. So we'll see this inside in Samuel book 1, source number 6. Nachash the Ammonite went up and camped against Yavesh Gilad. And all the people of Yavesh Gilad said to Nachash, "Make a treaty with us, and we shall serve you." Nachash the Ammonite said to them, "On this condition will I make a treaty with you, by gouging out the right eye of every one of you, and I shall make it an insult against all of Israel." The elders of Yavesh said to him, "Give us 7 days' respite, that we may send messengers throughout the entire border of Israel, and if there's no one to save us, we shall come out to you." The messengers came to Givat of Saul, and spoke the words in the ears of the people, and the people raised their voices and cried, "Behold, Saul came after the cattle from the field," and Saul said, "What is troubling the people that they cry?" And they told him the words of the people of Yavesh. A spirit of God passed over Saul when he heard these words, and his wrath was kindled greatly. He took a pair of oxen and cut them into pieces, and sent them throughout the entire border of Israel in the hand of messengers, saying, "Whosoever does not go forth after Saul and after Samuel, so shall be done to his oxen." And a fear from God fell upon the people, and they went forth as one man. Just to get the gist of that story, Nachash, this guy, threatens to go to war with the Jews. But he's ready to make a treaty with them, a peace with them, so to speak, on one condition, that he goes and gouges out the right eye of every Jew. What a horrible thing. The people run to Saul, begging him to save them, and Saul gathers his army and vanquishes this guy Nachash. Before going to war, he had to count his troops, and he did so like this. The verse says he counted them in Bezek, and the children of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. Rashi, the commentator, explains he counted them in Bezek. As we said earlier from the Talmud, the sages say this means clay shards. Others say it means stones. He took a stone from each person and counted the stones. Now let's see a different part in the book of Samuel, book 1, where we see the idea of where Saul counted the people with sheep. Samuel, source 7. Samuel said to Saul, "God sent me to anoint you to be king over his people, over Israel. And now listen to the voice of the words of God. So said the Lord of hosts. I remember what Amalek did to Israel. Now how he ambushed him on the way when he came up out of Egypt. Now go and you shall smite Amalek, and you shall utterly destroy all that is his, and you shall not have any pity on him. You shall slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Saul called the people together, and he counted them in Telaim, 200,000 footmen, and 3,000 were the men of Judah. Amalek was the nation that attacked us when we came out of Egypt before we received the Torah, and they attacked us. You know what the reason they attacked us was? Nada, no reason. They just wanted to do it. As the sages say, they had incredible chutzpah. There's no real good translation for chutzpah in English. I did hear a close translation once. What was it? Audacity. Yeah, they had the audacity. It's not chutzpah, but it's as close to attack the Jewish people for absolutely no reason. Rashi says he counted them with sheep. So the verse says tilaim. Tilaim can also be understood as sheep. He instructed them all to take a sheep from the king's flock, and then he counted the sheep because it is forbidden to count the Jews. As the verse says, you will not be able to count them due to their great number. So when preparing for the war with Amalek, Saul needed to count the Jewish people, and he did so indirectly. He told each one to take a sheep from the royal flocks and put it aside, and then he counted the sheep. Section C, 2 kinds of counting. The Rebbe asks a very interesting question. The question can be asked, why does the Talmud in Yuma derive the prohibition against counting the Jewish people from the verse regarding Saul, which says, and he counted them with bezek, or, and he counted them with sheep? Why not derive it from the verse, when you take the sum of the children of Israel according to their numbers, let each one give to God an atonement for his soul, as the Talmud does in Brachot. Deriving the law from a verse in the Torah rather from a verse in prophets would make the law biblical in status, and this verse is something that even school children know. It seems very strange. Let's put it this way. I'll give you an example, an analogy. Somebody asks you, when did you eat lunch yesterday? What time was it? And you say, I ate lunch at 1:30. 1:30, how do you know it was 1:30? So you say, well, I glanced out the window at the time I was eating lunch, and I saw the way the light of the sun was shining through the window at this particular angle, not this one, and I understood from the ray of light and the distance that I was standing from the window that the sun was only shining at this particular angle at this time of day, so it must be 1:30. There's a much simpler answer. Instead of saying that the whole thing with the sun, you could have said, well, actually, I know what time it was because I looked at the clock when I was eating lunch. It was 1:30. Okay? So you have 2 options. You could give a whole convoluted scientific explanation about the sun shining through your window, and it wasn't too cloudy, so you're able to tell. Or you could just say I looked at the clock, it was 1:30, which is much more straightforward and simple, and it's much more, I guess, accurate in a sense. So similar thing happens here. The Talmud in the book of Yuma learns the prohibition of counting the Jewish people from a story that happened with King Saul in the prophets. There's an explicit verse in the Torah that clearly indicates you have to count Jews through coins or through some other object. Otherwise, it's going to be a plague with the half shekel. Why is the Talmud learning this prohibition from something it says in the prophets, some story with King Saul? Why not learn it straight from what it says in the Torah? The second question is a little more involved. It's not a similar question. It's a whole question with King Saul and King David, learning one from the other. I'm going to skip this question. The answer is like this. To answer the question, we must adopt the approach of the commentators who distinguish between a census for a mitzvah purpose and counting for a non-mitzvah purpose. The Talmud in Yuma explicitly states it is forbidden to count the Jewish people even for a mitzvah purpose. Therefore, the Talmud brings the verses, he counted them with bezek and he counted them with sheep, which were stated in the context of wars. Many of the wars that the Jewish people fought were mitzvahs. They were required to have these wars. It wasn't optional, like if you want to conquer this land, you can go ahead and do it. No, certain wars they were obligated to fight. And that was that was what was associated with this count that Saul did. The Talmud did not quote the verse when you take the sum, which is said about the half shekel, as the source because that verse is stated in the context of non-mitzvah purposes. The non-mitzvah meaning can be deduced from the term kisisa, when you take, which Rashi explains to mean when you wish to know their number, referring to a choice made by Moses' discretion. So when the verse talks about the half shekel coin, there's a mitzvah to count, not to count. There's a mitzvah to give a half shekel every year. Every person has to give a half shekel. But God told Moses, if you would like to count the Jewish people at any time, do so through a half shekel, do so through something else. Okay, so it was a non-mitzvah thing. The census during the time of King David was also not for a mitzvah purpose. And this is why the Talmud in Brachot quotes the verse, when you take the sum, kisisa, about the half shekel, as a source. Because the discretionary nature of David's count is evident from the fact that his general Yoav argued with David and asserted that the census wasn't necessary. So again, there's two types of censuses. Try saying that a few times fast. A count for a mitzvah purpose and a count that's just if you want to. The Torah's verse, when you take the sum of the children of Israel, which forbids a direct count, is referring to a discretionary census, a count, that's something that the king or the leader of the Jewish people wants to do at their own desire. Therefore, the Talmud cites this verse as a source for the prohibition against direct counting when discussing David's census, which was also a discretionary count. It brings a verse to support this. Kisisa, when you count, if you count. If you want to count, use coins or use something else. But the above four sources don't address a census for a mitzvah purpose. That's different. Perhaps such a count, or it seems to be different, perhaps such a count may be carried out directly. Maybe you, for a mitzvah purpose, you could point at Jews and say 1, 2, 3. Only the stories about Saul's counts, which were for the mitzvah purpose of counting the soldiers going out to necessary wars, can serve as proof that even a mitzvah count must be performed indirectly. This is why the Talmud in Yuma cites the Saul stories, because it seeks to establish the prohibition of direct counting even for mitzvah purposes. And this is going to play out also in shul. When you're counting Jewish men for a minyan, you're supposed to have 10 to pray together, at least 10. We'll see toward the end of the lesson that we don't do it directly. We don't count 1, 2, 3, 4. It's how it's for a mitzvah. It's so important. Maybe you should just count them as they are. No, you got to use some other method, which we do. So going further. Says the Rebbe, we explained, based on Rashi, that our Torah portion is addressing a census carried out. How much time do we have? Carried out at Moses' discretion. This raises a question. A census carries the risk of triggering a plague, and neutralizing that danger requires specific steps. How is it then that Moses, the faithful shepherd of the Jewish people, independently chose to carry out a census despite the associated risk? It's a very interesting question. It's not that you can count Jews. You're allowed to. If you'd like to, just do it through this method. That's not how we look at it. Counting Jews is dangerous. You shouldn't count Jews. If there's a need to count Jews, you should do it through an indirect method. So if something is inherently dangerous, has an inherent danger in it, why would Moses, who loved the Jewish people to more than his own self, to his very core, why would he count them? Yes, he's doing a protective measure. He's counting with half shekel coins. But why would he do it in the first place? Why would he want to do this? There's a potential. Maybe somebody will forget to give a coin or whatever. I don't know what. One of the census takers will count the person instead of the coin. You never know what could happen. I'm just making this up. But why would he make this thing in the first place? And the answer is fascinating. It's beautiful. The explanation is, the verse at the beginning of the portion of the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, states, these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Rashi comments over there, although they were counted earlier in the portion of Vayigash toward the end of Genesis, they are counted again here in order to show their preciousness. Counting out the people expresses the importance of each individual. Without any distinction between great people and ordinary folk, all are counted equally. We can extrapolate, we can learn from this to Moses' count for the Jewish people. Moses counted them in order to show their preciousness to God. Responding to Moses' intentions, God said, when you wish to know their number, don't do a direct head count. Rather, every person should contribute a half shekel. And when you count the shekels, you will get the number of the people. When the count is carried out according to this process, the risk of a plague is neutralized. So why did Moses decide to do it, even though there's an inherent risk? Because he wanted to express and show and reveal the preciousness of the Jewish people to Hashem. Because you count things that you find precious. Why do you have a wallet full of cash? You find people that have a wallet full of cash, they count it all the time. Why are you counting? You know how much money is there. You counted it 5 minutes ago. Because it's precious, it's important to them, valuable to them. There's a story, actually. I wish I had more details to the story. It's a famous, it's a short little quip, but it's a beautiful point. It's a powerful point. The Lubavitcher Rebbe would, starting from the mid 80s, late 80s, would stand almost every Sunday, came known as Sunday dollars, would stand and had hundreds and thousands of people would wait online for hours, would go around the block in around 770s block and Eastern Parkway and on what is it over there, New York Avenue, so on and so forth, waiting to just spend 30 seconds or less, even sometimes more, with the Rebbe, to be in the Rebbe's presence and to receive $1 for charity from him, for tzedakah. The Rebbe would give $1 and usually give a blessing associated with that. And the idea was to take that $1 and give it to charity. Of course, a holy person, leader of the Jewish people, gave you $1. You don't want to give up that $1. So instead, people do is they would give another $1 to charity. And you have to understand that the Rebbe was there for hours and hours and hours. Sometimes people they had a problem. They'd come to the Rebbe, ask quickly for help, and the Rebbe would give an answer instantaneously what they need to do. And it's all on video, by the way. You can watch it it's available on YouTube even. Fascinating, incredible stuff, crazy stories as well. Anyway, but the Rebbe didn't sit for hours and hours and hours and hours. The Rebbe stood on his feet for hours and hours. He wasn't a young man. He wasn't 35, 40 years old. He was in his late 80s. Okay. He's standing for hours and hours. One time somebody asked the Rebbe, you're standing for hours and hours and hours. I'm sure you're exhausted. You should sit down maybe. And the Rebbe's response was, as they heard the story, the Rebbe's response was, you don't get tired when you're counting diamonds. Don't get tired when you're counting diamonds. Beautiful, beautiful point. Okay, section D. We'll wrap it up with this. Is there a 10th? Says the Rebbe, it is forbidden to count the Jewish people directly, even when it is done for a mitzvah purpose, as the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, rules in his code of Jewish law. Can't count Jews. We see this expressed in the count that was done for the purpose of determining who would perform the day's service in the temple. Rather than counting the priests, the officer would announce, raise your fingers. Each priest would raise as many fingers as they wished, and the officer would count the fingers. The reason why they would count fingers rather than priests themselves is because it is forbidden to count the Jewish people directly. Counting must be done indirectly, as the verse says, he counted them with sheep. There's a procedure that was done in the lesson here. It quotes the entire section of Maimonides where he described it at length. We're going to skip that because of time. But in short, you had hundreds of thousands of, maybe, I don't know, a lot of Kohanim, a lot of priests in the Jewish people. And the temple, which is where they did their service, they were the ones who did the service in the temple. There was a limited amount of space. You know, how many people were associated with the service every day? We're not talking about thousands of people. We're talking about hundreds. And how do you decide which Kohen is going to be working that day? So they had a guy, they had a bunch of Kohanim sitting in a semicircle, and it would decide on a number. The officer in charge of this lottery, let's call it, you decide on a number, let's say, 55. And then each Kohen would stick out 1 or 2 fingers, like this, 1 or 2, okay? And instead of counting the people, going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and to get to 55, the idea was whoever was the last number, whoever 55 landed on, they were picked first. So you count instead the fingers. You're not counting the priests, the Kohanim, you're counting the fingers. It's again avoiding counting Jews directly. I will say it's an important point, a lesson in honesty. You have to be honest at all times, even the slightest areas. It doesn't say it in this lesson. I'm just throwing it in here quickly. That regarding that counts, you had to use these fingers. You couldn't use your thumb. You couldn't count. You do 1 or 2. The reason given by Maimonides is, if I'm not mistaken, I'm remembering correctly, he says that the thumb is easy to pull in, and if somebody sees how the count is going, they can hold out 1 finger, or whatever, holding out 2 fingers like this, and they could say, "No, I'm just holding out 1. It's not. My thumb's not. I'm not holding my thumb." Or they could do the other way around. They could say, "Oh yeah, I'm holding out 2. See, I had 2 the whole time. See, 2." You can play games with the thumb. When you have these two fingers, it's either 1 or it's 2. You can't play with that. Okay. The purpose, says the Rebbe, the purpose of the contribution of the half shekel was in order to not count the people directly, but rather to do so through their half shekel contributions. The count of the people would be deduced from the sum of the shekels. For the same reason, when we count if there is a minyan of 10 present for prayers, we don't count the people directly. There are various alternative methods. Either we count, saying not one, not two, etc. This is actually the way I was raised. When you count Jews, like you point, so not one, not two, not 55, not 56. It sounds a little funny, but you're understanding what the number is without actually counting them. He's not one, he's not two. We avoid the whole issue by doing so. Or we count by reciting a verse that has 10 words. One word is said for every person present, and when the verse is finished, we know that the minyan is complete. Rashi, again, but not in his commentary, rather in his Sefer, his book called the Sefer HaPardes, writes, when we gather in the synagogue and wish to know if there are 10 present, the rule is that we do not count directly, even for this mitzvah purpose. The count should be done by reciting the words of the verse, and I, through your abundant kindness, come into your house. I bow toward your holy sanctuary in awe of you, saying one word for each person present. Count out those words. I think there's 20. I did the count the other day. I counted those 20 words. In the Hebrew, there's actually only 10 words. It's a verse that talks about coming into the synagogue, into the sanctuary. When the verse is concluded, we know that 10 are present, said Rashi. However, fascinating point. Ready for this? In the concise code of Jewish law, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the abridged code of Jewish law, it says, it is customary to count the assembled through the verse, grant salvation to your people and bless your heritage, tend them and exalt them forever, which has 10 words. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the abridged code of Jewish law, says a different verse to use. It cites a different custom. Not the verse that talks about coming into the sanctuary. It talks about the verse, which grants salvation to your people. That's a very interesting question. What is the reason for the change of verse? The rationale for Rashi's verse is clear because it includes the words, come into your house, which refers to the synagogue. It makes sense that when we gather in the shul to pray to God, we should use a verse on this theme. Why then was the change made to use the verse, grant salvation to your people, Hashia Samecha? Why did this change occur? The answer is going to blow you away. Indeed, the verse, and I through your abundant kindness come into your house, is more topical. It fits with the topic more. However, the latest generations are the era preceding the arrival of Mashiach, the era of redemption, during which we experience a great darkness, as the appropriate time for Mashiach's arrival has already come. When 10 Jews gather together, God's presence is felt, as explained in Tanya, chapter 23. This divine presence is found even when the people aren't discussing Torah matters, and it is all the more present when they are gathering in the shul to pray to God. Therefore, the people's first request at this auspicious gathering is, grant salvation to your people and bless your heritage, tend them and exalt them forever. This is why the custom has developed to use this verse, because it gives voice to the prayer of the Jewish people for the redemption. Grant salvation to your people. We're so anticipating it so much. At every opportunity, we need to express this anticipation. Counting Jews from Minyan, Hoshia es amecha uvarich es nachlasecha. Grant salvation to your people. May we merit the speedy fulfillment of our prayer and request, grant salvation to your people and bless your heritage, tend them and exalt them forever in the true and complete redemption through the righteous Mashiach. May it be in the most speedy fashion. Have a good Shabbos. See you next week. Emir Sashem, God willing.